Let's speak now to Mike Buckley, who's a former Labour Party advisor, and speak about some of the things that we're beginning to learn from the Starmer government and the sort of stuff Starmer's been up to, and get his take on the lot of it. Mike, is wonderful having you on the show. And can I just say, a lovely sort of relaxing thought that I get to sit with someone who's on the other side of politics, who's just a nice, decent, sensible chap, because I've just come off the back of Steve Headley, and frankly, I still haven't caught my breath. That was a bit of a whirlwind of an interview, let's say. Let's talk first of all about the idea that workers are going to gain the right to ask for a 4-day week. Now, there have been a few trials of this in various places. I think one particular local authority tested it and sort of quickly scrapped the scheme and thought that it didn't really work very well. And Labour are saying they want to go after growth. Growth is the most important thing. Do you think that this is actually the right approach to achieving growth? And is it the sort of thing that's going to affect everybody? I mean, if you're a brickie or a carpenter or a plumber or a sparky, you probably can't afford a 4-day week. So it seems to me that it's only going to be the sort of more well-off middle classes who get to have an extra long weekend.
Well, thanks for the kind welcomes. Good to see you too. In terms of the 4-day working week, it sounds like the government's saying that workers will have the right to ask their employer. But of course, I think the employer will, of course, retain the right to say, well, no, that isn't appropriate in this particular role or this kind of job. And you're right. If somebody's self-employed, of course, I mean, they don't have an option on working, probably many more hours than 40 hours a week in lots of cases, because they've just got to make sure they're doing the work and getting the income. But this is about employed people going into their boss and saying, I'd like to work a 4-day week. Now, my understanding is there's been different studies done in various nations, some of them showing that this makes actually people more productive and would therefore contribute to growth. In other cases, I think it's less conclusive, or indeed probably in some cases there's a negative result. I would imagine that in part depends on the role and in part depends on the organisation and how it's run. But I think most importantly, the employer will have the right to say, well, no, you can't do that. That isn't appropriate in this role.
Yeah, do you think there's a risk, though, like I said, that it would be appropriate for roles where people might work in sort of certain office blocks and it doesn't matter whether you're in there or not, you can do stuff from home and so on and so forth. But people who are kind of on the sort of front line, the backbone of this country, people who prop us up, the people on production lines, the people who are driving delivery vans and driving lorries, for example, or pushing people in wheelchairs around hospitals, that those are exactly sort of people who won't get to have the 4-day week. And so it kind of seems a little bit unfair towards the working classes. It'll be a privilege largely enjoyed by the more comfortably off middle classes.
I think there probably is some truth to that. It's obviously going to be much easier to do this if you're working an office job 9 to 5. Say if you're only working in the office a couple of days a week, they might say, well, yeah, just work longer hours at home and make sure you get the job done. And in lots of jobs, it's appropriate to measure somebody's output by the work that they do, rather than the number of hours they're in a particular position or in a particular building. And that's understandable. You're right, that's much more difficult if you, as you say, you're a hospital porter, or if you're, obviously, if you're a truck driver, you can't do it because there are strict limits, and rightly so, on the number of hours it's safe for someone to drive. So there will be a division between who this is appropriate for and who it isn't appropriate for. Maybe there needs to be something done to recognise that fact. But I suppose, on the other hand, it's kind of an outcome of the fact that people choose to go into certain professions, and this is one of the results of the fact that you've chosen to do this job rather than that job.
I mean, but let's move on to another policy now, and sticking with our hospital porter, let's call him Jim, and let's throw in there Barry, who's the cement mixer whiz, who've just done 5 days a week because they don't really get to have the long weekend because they've got to feed their families, and that's how it goes. But they don't mind. They nose to the grindstone and get on with it. Roll up their sleeves and keep Britain functioning. Then decide they want to go after work, after their shift, to Wetherspoons, and it's a nice sunny day, and they've ordered their pint, and they go and sit in the garden and pull out the old Benson and Hedges to really unwind. And it turns out they're not allowed to anymore. Does the Labour Party really hate the working classes?
No, not at all. Of course not. I mean, 10% of people in this country smoke. And that number is falling every year. Thankfully, an increasingly small proportion of the population smoke. The majority of those people will be, nothing against older people, but they will be older people, because thankfully younger people are, generally speaking, not choosing to smoke. There is obviously a problem with kids taking up vapes, and I think something needs to be done to dissuade that. But thankfully, most people are choosing not to smoke. We know for a fact that smoking is a major contributor, of course, to ill health, and we know that passive smoking does have an impact even in outdoor spaces, particularly where people are compressed together. public opinion is behind this. The vast majority of the public will think this is a good idea, so they don't. Most people don't.
If it's only 1 in 10 people who smoke, right, and the number's dropping off anyway because other policies such as public information, the fact that even if you buy a bag of rolling tobacco, it's about 25 quid in this day and age, do seem to be having an impact. Can't you just let the 10% who do want a cigarette outside, you know, it's not inside anymore, can't you just let them do it? Isn't this sort of a signal that this government kind of wants a bit too much control in people's lives and the things they might enjoy? They know it's bad for them. Lots of things are bad for us that we do, but kind of part of being a human and making decisions and finding your comfort where you want to find it is not having the government say don't do this and don't do that.
I think it's partly the government care about people's health. It's partly that they care about the use of the NHS's resources, and it isn't a good use of the NHS resources to have to cater for people who've been made ill by passive smoking, for example, because they're sat in a pub garden. And it's also about thinking about, well, where is the greater good? On the one hand, yes, it's going to be annoying if somebody's a smoker and they're sitting in a pub garden and they can't smoke. But that's 10% of those people. The 90% of those people are sitting there not smoking and not wanting to get lung cancer. So prioritising the needs of those people above the needs of that 10%.
The argument for banning it indoors, the argument for banning it indoors was the passive smoking argument, which I think is very hard unless you're basically sitting on someone's lap with your gob pressed up to theirs. Surely it's quite difficult to passive smoke if someone's sitting outside.
We've all done it. I mean, I've sat in pub gardens or, you know, been in outdoor environments when somebody's smoking and it walks across, and sometimes you can move out of the way. Sometimes if it's particularly cramped, for example, at a sporting event, you can't do that. And it is frustrating when you're sitting there thinking, I don't actually want to be breathing this stuff in because I do care about my current and future health.
I mean, would it not be better then, at least, to have a smoking section of a pub garden? Or, I mean, I don't know. I haven't been to a sporting event for ages. Costs an arm and a leg these days to go sit in the terraces anywhere. But I'm sure that various sports grounds, I can't remember the last time I went to Kingsholm in Gloucester, but I don't know whether you can light up in the shed. I mean, someone would have to message me and let me know. But surely it's within the wit and the whim of venues to be able to handle this without the government doing a blanket ban.
I don't know. I mean, we don't know yet if the government's actually going to go through with this or not. I think it's a suggestion at the minute. But I suspect that they will be encouraged to do it, in part, of course, because of the health implications, but also because the surveys that have been done so far show that the vast majority of the public think this is a good idea, because I think the vast majority of the public, in my view, I'm not a smoker, would rather not breathe somebody else's smoke. And I'm sure as well that the government sees this as another measure to encourage current smokers, A, to smoke less, and B, to stop smoking at all, which I think has to be a good thing.
Let's talk now about this report that's come out, which is showing that record numbers of migrants living in Britain are jobless, with more than 1.6 million unemployed or economically inactive, costing the taxpayer an estimated $8 billion. I read some more research on this, which thinks the cost could be as much as $20 billion. But the point is, we've been told for a long time, haven't we, that we need a higher rate of immigration because it increases the GDP of the economy. And similar studies done in similar countries to ours are showing, actually, in places like Germany, in fact, that immigration is now having a net detrimental effect on the economy there. We also know that vast majority of people, for many elections now, be it the referendum campaign or voting for the Conservatives, have really called for at least some controls on immigration. And yet when Sir Keir Starmer stood in the Rose Garden of 10 Downing Street and spoke about all the social ills and the rot that set in and what was behind the riots and so on and so forth, not once did he seem to mention the I word. Do you think he really needs to do that? Do you think actually he is going to do that?
Well, in terms of the economically inactive people, that's not a problem particularly amongst the migrant population or a foreign-born population as opposed to a British-born population. That's a problem across society, and we know that sadly there are millions of people who are not in work or education, and they should be. That is a problem the government needs to address from people from all backgrounds. When it comes to the stats, in terms of who's working and who's not working, a foreign-born person of working age in the UK is more likely to be working statistically than a British-born person. If they're male, if they're female, if they're a woman, they're slightly less likely to be working than a British-born female. That presumably is to do with family dynamics and so on. But certainly, there's no correlation between somebody being foreign-born and not working. They're not statistically more likely to not be working than a British-born person. Carry on. I was going to say, I do want the government to take action to get those people into work. That's important for them. future, also for the public budget, of course. But the other fact remains is that we do have a problem with the fact we've got labour shortages across our society, in the public sector and in the private sector. We do need people with certain skills to be brought into the country to do those jobs while we're training our British people to do it. At the moment, they're not British people with the skill sets to match the jobs that are available. That's a problem because we just haven't invested in training. And as we know, there's a big problem amongst young people even now. You know, half of young people about go to university. The other half, we just don't have the vocational training in place that lots of other nations do to meet the needs of those young people. And I do want to see that change, and I know this government wants to see that change as well.
Yeah, I mean, I would very much like to see social mobility and proper sort of skills training brought back in, especially for young people who aren't necessarily suited for the academic path. That's something that we very much agree on. You spoke about foreign-born people and, you know, who's got a job and who hasn't, and mentioned that potentially it could be a lot of the women aren't the ones working. They might come from a more traditional family unit where they stay at home, probably have a higher birth rate as well, actually, and therefore end up being net beneficiaries from the economy rather than net contributors. How that balances out per household, I don't know. I don't have the statistics on that. But the previous government thought that it would be a good idea to increase the income needed to bring a foreign partner to the UK from 29,000 to 38,700. One assumes to make sure that that does square off. So if you've got a household where only one person's working and you want to bring your other half, you've got to earn 38,700, because if you then have kids and the cost of them going to school and, you know, all the other benefits that one gets in the States, whether you're born abroad or born here, hopefully begins to balance out somewhat, that we reach an equilibrium. And yet Yvette Cooper is thinking about scrapping that. Is that why is she doing that? And do you think that's the right way forward? Because if we're going to make sure that the economy grows and actually have to take some tough decisions when we know people are extremely concerned about immigration, that to me seems like a very good place to begin, and yet she's getting rid of it by the looks of things.
I'm not sure if they've confirmed they're getting rid of that yet. If they do, that would be a response to the fact that we do have labour shortages, as I was mentioning, in society, in the public sector, as in the NHS, social care, etc., and also in the private sector as well. We do have skill shortages. Those gaps need to be met, or we're not going to get economic growth, and we're not going to get an NHS and social care system or an education system that meets the needs of the population. I mean, as we know, we've got an ageing society, as in the proportion of people who are retired is getting bigger, the proportion of people in society who are of working age is getting smaller. We need people of working age. We can't go back 30 years and increase the birth rate. We are where we are. So there is going to be an ongoing need for inward migration in the future. The question is, who are those people? Where do they come from? And as I referred to earlier on, there is, of course, the fact that we do have people in this country who aren't working, who could and should be working, and those people need to be enabled to do that, either through training or through some other support to get them out of the house and back into the workforce.
Steve, thank you. Steve, sorry. Mike, I've still got PTSD from speaking to Steve Headley. Mike Buckley, thank you ever so much for coming on. It's a delight speaking to someone like Mike, who you can just have a sensible conversation with.